Police last month issued a 100,000 rand reward for information that could lead to Nyalara, known as Bara's arrest. He was wanted for a spate of violent crimes dating back to at least 2016 in Kalicha.
In the early hours of a tense Cape Town morning, gunfire shattered the silence. Police tactical units closed in on a high-profile target, one of South Africa's most wanted men. Inside a hideout, Yanga Bara Nyalara, the alleged mastermind behind a sprawling extortion and crime syndicate, made his last stand. Moments later, it was over. The feared kingpin lay dead, his reign of terror ending in a bloody shootout. For years, Nyalara had built an empire on fear, orchestrating violent attacks, running extortion rackets, and ruling Cape Town's underworld with an iron fist. His name sent chills through business owners, gang rivals, and even law enforcement. Despite multiple arrests, he evaded justice, always a step ahead, until February 2025. How did a man once seen as untouchable fall so dramatically? Who was Yanga Bara Nyalara before he became Cape Town's most feared crime boss? And did his death truly bring an end to the chaos? Or was he just another piece in a much larger puzzle? Welcome to my channel. If today is your first time coming across my channel, please go ahead and subscribe to this channel. Give this video a thumbs up. Before he became Cape Town's most feared crime boss, Yanga Bara Nyalara was just another name in a city teetering on the edge of lawlessness. But in the underbelly of the Western Cape, where gang violence and corruption run deep, some names are destined to be whispered in fear. His would become one of them. Yanga Nyalara was born into a world where survival wasn't just a skill, it was a necessity. He grew up in the townships of Cape Town, where poverty, crime, and desperation shaped young lives long before they had a chance to dream of anything else. These were areas where opportunity was scarce, but power could be seized if you were willing to take it. From an early age, Nyalara understood that the streets played by their own rules. The police were rarely seen unless it was to pick up bodies, and the people who had real influence weren't politicians or businessmen. They were gangsters. They drove the best cars, wore the finest clothes, and walked through the townships like kings. As a teenager, he learned quickly that respect wasn't given, it was taken. He ran errands for local gangsters, watching and learning. At first, it was small things, delivering packages, keeping a lookout, passing messages. But in the world he was growing up in, small steps led to giant leaps. Like many before him, Nyalara's descent into crime was gradual. He started as a foot soldier in local gangs, getting his hands dirty in petty thefts and street fights. He was a fighter, known for his sharp mind and even sharper instincts. While others resorted to reckless violence, he was different, calculated, patient. The townships of Cape Town were ruled by criminal networks that fed off fear and desperation. Extortion was the golden ticket, and those who controlled it held real power. Protection rackets became Nyalara's stepping stone into the bigger leagues. At first, he was just collecting payments for others, but he quickly realized something. Why work for someone else when he could build his own empire? By his early 20s, Nyalara had carved out a reputation for himself. He wasn't just another gangster. He was a businessman with a street mentality. He understood that money, not bullets, was the key to power. He began forming his own network, recruiting loyal foot soldiers and making strategic alliances with bigger criminal syndicates. But what set him apart was his understanding of Cape Town's deep-rooted corruption. He knew how to manipulate the system, bribing cops, intimidating witnesses, and making himself indispensable to those in power. Even when law enforcement tried to build cases against him, their evidence would mysteriously disappear, and witnesses would suddenly change their stories, or vanish entirely. Every crime boss has a moment when they go from being a small-time hustler to something much bigger. For Nyalara, That moment came when he orchestrated a brutal takeover of several extortion rackets in Cape Town's busiest business districts. The message was clear. He wasn't just another gangster. He was the new power in town. The money gave him power, and power made him untouchable. He wasn't just running a gang, he was running an empire. But as history has proven time and time again, the higher you climb, the harder you fall. And for Yanga Bara Nyalara, the fall was just beginning. One of the first things Nyalara understood was that violence alone wasn't enough to build an empire. Killing rivals and stealing money could only get you so far. The real money was in extortion, the protection business. It worked like this: small business owners, nightclub managers, taxi drivers, anyone trying to make an honest living, would be forced to pay a fee to Nyalara's men. In return, they were protected from criminals. But here's the twist. The criminals they were being protected from were Nyalara's own people. If a shop owner refused to pay, bad things would start happening. Windows would be smashed, customers scared away, maybe even a fire in the middle of the night. And if someone really wanted to test Nyalara's patience, well, people had disappeared for less. This system made him rich, very rich. Money gave Nyalara the power to expand. He started taking over more areas, pushing out smaller gangs and forcing them to work for him or disappear. Every taxi rank, every nightclub, every busy street had to pay its share. But running an empire wasn't just about making money, it was about staying in control. Nyalara wasn't just feared on the streets, he was respected. He didn't just use violence, he used strategy. He made sure his men were loyal, paying them well, and rewarding those who proved themselves. He also knew how to use fear to his advantage. When someone betrayed him, he didn't just punish them, he made an example out of them. People needed to see what happened when you crossed Yanga Bara Nyalara. One of the biggest reasons Nyalara stayed in power for so long was his ability to manipulate the system. He wasn't just fighting against the police, he was working with some of them. It's an open secret in Cape Town. Crime and corruption go hand in hand. Some police officers were more interested in money than justice. Nyalara made sure they were taken care of. A few well-placed bribes, and suddenly investigations against him would slow down. Evidence would go missing. Witnesses would change their stories or refuse to testify. Some even say he had connections with politicians and business leaders. He was too powerful to take down, until the police finally decided enough was enough. At his peak, Yanga Bara Nyalara was one of the most feared men in Cape Town. He controlled businesses, gang territories, and even some law enforcement officers. He lived like a king, driving luxury cars, wearing expensive clothes, and throwing lavish parties. But deep down, he must have known it wouldn't last forever. The police were watching, rival gangs were getting stronger, and as history has shown, no crime boss stays on top forever. Nyalara had built an empire on fear and violence, but the same fear that made him powerful would soon become his greatest weakness. Because when people are too scared, they stop talking. They stop warning you when danger is coming. And when it finally arrived, Nyalara never saw it coming. By 2023, Yanga Bara Nyalara was no longer just a gangster, he was an institution. His name carried weight in Cape Town's underworld. Business owners whispered it in fear. Gang members swore loyalty to it. Even law enforcement struggled to touch him. He had built something bigger than a gang. He had built an empire, but every empire has its peak. And for Nyalara, this was it. Nyalara had his hands in everything. Extortion was still his biggest moneymaker, but he had expanded his operations. Drug trafficking, illegal firearms, even human trafficking. If there was money to be made in Cape Town's streets, Nyalara was involved. Taxi ranks were his. Bars and nightclubs operated under his rules. Business owners paid their dues or faced the consequences. Some tried to resist, but the results were always the same. Stores burned, cars bombed, families threatened. Eventually, they all gave in. The police were constantly investigating him, but he seemed untouchable. Some officers were on his payroll. Others were too afraid to go after him. This was Yanga Bara Nyalara at his most powerful. With great power came great enemies. Other gangs wanted a piece of the empire Nyalara had built, but he wasn't about to share. Rival groups tried to move in on his territories. Some challenged his control over taxi routes, others wanted a cut of the drug trade. What followed was a brutal wave of violence. Drive-by shootings, assassinations, bombings. Cape Town became a battlefield. Nyalara made one thing clear: he wasn't going anywhere. If someone threatened his business, they wouldn't live long enough to try again. But while he was fighting off rivals, he didn't realize a bigger threat was closing in, one he couldn't kill or intimidate. For years, Nyalara had played a dangerous game with the law. He was always one step ahead, avoiding major arrests and walking free whenever he was caught. But that was starting to change. South African authorities had had enough. A special task force was created with one mission: bring down Yanga Bara Nyalara. Surveillance was increased, wiretaps were placed, informants were recruited. The police weren't just arresting his foot soldiers anymore, they were going after the king himself. At first, Nyalara didn't take it seriously. He had dodged the law before, and he believed he could do it again. But this time was different. The walls were closing in, and he didn't even realize it. As his power reached its peak, so did his vulnerability. He had made too many enemies. The police were watching his every move. And soon, the man who once ruled Cape Town's streets would find himself with nowhere left to run. It started small, just another investigation, like the many that had come before. But this time, the police weren't playing by the same rules. Authorities had formed a special task force dedicated to taking down Cape Town's most dangerous criminals, and Nyalara was at the top of the list. They studied his movements, tracked his financial transactions, and tapped into his network. Every call, every meeting, every deal, law enforcement was watching. For the first time, Nyalara's confidence became his weakness. He had operated for so long without serious consequences that he started taking risks. He was used to having informants inside the police force, but this time he didn't realize that the real informants were inside his own crew. In mid-2022, police finally made a breakthrough. After gathering enough evidence, they launched a massive operation to bring him in. It wasn't just a few officers knocking on his door. This was a full-scale raid. Tactical teams stormed a location where Nyalara was believed to be hiding. Helicopters circled overhead. Roads were blocked off. This time, there would be no escape. After his arrest in 2022, many believed Nyalara's days of terror were over. But the man who once ruled Cape Town's streets wasn't ready to give up his throne. Despite facing serious charges, he managed to keep his network alive. Orders still flowed from his prison cell, businesses still paid their fees, and rivals still feared his name. Then, in a shocking twist, Nyalara escaped custody. Details of how he managed to break free remain unclear, but one thing was certain: he was back on the streets, and the police were more determined than ever to take him down. With South Africa's most wanted man on the run, a nationwide manhunt was launched. The government wasn't going to let him slip away again. Law enforcement tracked Nyalara's movements relentlessly. Informants whispered about his whereabouts, but catching him wasn't easy. He was constantly on the move, hiding in safe houses, changing locations, and relying on his loyalists to keep him protected. But the net was tightening. In February 2025, police received a major tip. Nyalara was hiding in a high-security hideout in Cape Town. They knew they had to act fast. This wasn't going to be a quiet arrest. They were going in, prepared for war. In the early hours of the morning, heavily armed tactical units moved in. Roads were blocked. Helicopters hovered overhead. Every exit was sealed. Nyalara, realizing he was trapped, refused to surrender. What followed was one of the deadliest police shootouts in Cape Town's history. Gunfire erupted as officers stormed the hideout. Nyalara and his men fought back, refusing to go down without a fight. The battle lasted minutes, but the destruction left behind felt like a war zone, and then it was over. When the smoke cleared, Yanga Bara Nyalara lay dead. The man who had once ruled Cape Town's underworld, who had built an empire of fear and violence, had met his end in the very chaos he had created. News of his death spread like wildfire. Some celebrated, believing Cape Town was finally free from his grip. Others mourned, seeing him as a product of a broken system, an outlaw who had played the game and lost. But one thing was clear. Yanga Bara Nyalara's reign was over. His empire had crumbled, his men scattered. His name, once spoken in fear, was now just another chapter in South Africa's long history of crime and violence. The kingpin was gone. But the question remained, had his death truly changed anything? Or was the cycle destined to continue? With Yanga Bara Nyalara dead, many believed Cape Town would finally find peace. His reign of terror had ended in a hail of bullets, his empire left in ruins. But crime doesn't die with one man. In the days after his death, a bigger question emerged. Did his downfall actually change anything? Or was he just another name in an endless cycle of violence? When a king falls, vultures circle. Nyalara had built a vast criminal network, and without him at the top, a war for control was inevitable. Rival gangs saw his death as an opportunity. Old enemies resurfaced. Even his former allies turned on each other, each wanting a piece of what was left of his empire. Shootings increased. Taxi ranks that once paid him protection money now became battlegrounds. Businesses that had lived under his rule were caught in the crossfire as different groups fought to take over his territory. For ordinary citizens, it felt like nothing had changed. The names were different, but the fear remained the same. Law enforcement celebrated Nyalara's death as a major victory. After years of chasing him, the man who had once been untouchable was finally gone. The government promised to crack down on organized crime, vowing that another Bara would never rise again. For a while, things seemed calmer. The extortion business took a hit. The police carried out more arrests, shutting down parts of Nyalara's network. But many knew that Cape Town's crime problem ran deeper than just one man. Months after his death, new gang leaders will emerge, filling the void he left behind. Some were former members of his organization. Others were longtime rivals, finally seizing their moment. The city continues to bleed, proving that Nyalara was not the cause of the problem. He was just a product of it. In the end, the death of Yanga Bara Nyalara was not the end of crime in Cape Town. It was just another chapter in a story that had been written long before him and would continue long after. The king was dead. But the game was still very much alive. Thank you for watching. Kindly like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comment below.